Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm Kris. This is well, it's 6 days old. Video from Epic History TV, HMS Victory, sailing and fighting a Napoleonic warship. I'm going to break this down into 2 videos, and let's hit the start button now.
HMS Victory, one of Britain's most powerful warships in an age when Britain dominated the seas. During the Napoleonic Wars, such ships were Britain's wooden walls, protecting the homeland from invasion while devastating enemy commerce and protecting Allied shipping. Ships of the line were the largest and most sophisticated war machines of the conflict. Britain had around 140 in total, more
They are impressive looking.
than any other nation. But her advantage came less from numbers or better ship design than the qualities of the men who sailed them.
Yeah.
Bold and experienced commanders, disciplined and eager crews, all full of confidence and accustomed to victory. This video is sponsored by...
And just so everyone, I'm sure you already know, but I did cover, I guess you would say, part 1. I think it was a 2-parter. A couple months ago, maybe? I don't even remember. But anyways, if I remember, I'll throw the link in the description on that one. 140 ships, just of those. Man, I don't remember what the crew amount was, but God, that's a lot of people. I see why they were impressing sailors. Is that the correct term? They needed a lot of people for their ships, didn't they?
At the height of the Napoleonic Wars, around 145,000 men served in Britain's Royal Navy, a number comparable to European field armies of the period. Ships of the line, like HMS Victory, required huge crews, not so much to sail her, as to man her heavy guns. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, she had 820 men aboard, a little short of her full complement of 850. Just 15 of these men were commissioned officers, 1 admiral commanding the fleet, 1 captain in command of the ship, 9 naval lieutenants, and 4 Royal Marine officers. Then the senior warrant officers, including the ship's master in charge of navigation, the gunner, responsible for the ship's guns, small arms, powder, and shot, the boatswain, responsible for sails and rigging, and who with his mates oversaw all work on deck. 2 ship's carpenters, responsible for keeping the ship afloat and making repairs, the purser, in charge of ship's provisions, a surgeon for the crew's physical welfare, and a chaplain for their spiritual.
That surgeon basically is just a guy with a bunch of saws. That's what he's there for.
Victory also had 21 midshipmen. These were young cadet officers, some of whom began their naval careers at just 13. They served a 6-year apprenticeship at sea, learning seamanship, sail handling, navigation, mathematics, and trigonometry. They'd then be qualified to sit the lieutenant's exam, a rigorous assessment by a board of naval captains. Further promotion to commander, then captain.
What's with this guy's nose?
would depend on merit and, crucially, social and political connections. The process could be hugely frustrating for those without influential friends.
Got this guy's nose. This guy's back here firing a bow and arrow that's invisible. This guy and this guy, their heads are pointed up. This guy's sound asleep. This guy's reading to people and no one's paying attention. Looks like he's stabbing. I thought he was stabbing him in the genitals. There's a lot going on in this painting.
As such,
this guy over here, look at, he's looking down at his own penis. There's just too much going on.
Satirized in this cartoon by the famous illustrator George Cruikshank. Some naval officers came from aristocratic families, but most were from what today we'd call the middle classes. HMS Victory carried 43 clerks, orderlies, stewards and servants to assist the officers. 69 junior warrant officers, petty officers and their mates held various specialist roles, such as coxswain, armourer and sailmaker. There were 212 able seamen, the veteran sailors, 193 ordinary seamen with at least a year's service, 87 landsmen, mostly new recruits, only good for hauling on ropes, 142 Royal Marine non-commissioned officers and privates, soldiers who fought at sea, led amphibious landings and enforced discipline, and 31 ship's boys, many of them orphans plucked from destitution, now destined for a life at sea. Each man was assigned a station for every manoeuvre. Top men were the fittest, bravest sailors who handled the sails high above deck. Forecastle men were knowledgeable veterans who handled anchors and bowsprit sails. The waisters in the ship's waist and afterguard on the quarterdeck and poop were for hauling on ropes. The crew was organised into two halves, the larboard watch and starboard watch. They took turns on and off duty, except for emergencies when all hands were called on deck. They were further organised into divisions, each commanded by a lieutenant responsible for his men's welfare and conduct. HMS Victory's crew, like that of most British warships, was surprisingly cosmopolitan. Most were from Britain and Ireland.
England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales. One guy from the Isle of Man. .48 unknown nationality. So, were these foreigners, were they willing? I'm sure that maybe they'll say, or is this what they impressed them?
Ireland, but about 10% were foreigners, including Americans, Italians, Dutch, Maltese and West Indians. About half were volunteers. The rest had been impressed, meaning they'd been forced into military service by the Navy's notorious press gangs. These naval recruitment parties scoured ports and passing ships for British sailors, all of whom were considered fair game for compulsory enlistment. The process was not always entirely peaceful. Navy press gangs were feared and despised by civilians. They were known to seize men who were not sailors or even British, though most were later released if they could prove their identity. And there were limits. Contrary to popular myth, the Navy did not press vagrants, nor did it accept criminals convicted of serious crimes.
That makes sense, because if you're out on the seas, you can't risk having a criminal that maybe kills one or two of your people, because what are you going to do with them? The only option is to throw off the ship, or kill them first and then throw them off.
To get the best out of a ship like Victory, the captain had to know his crew and his ship. Every vessel has its own best point of sailing relative to the wind. HMS Victory's was 1 or 2 points off her stern. This means she made her best speed, around 10 knots, sailing in these directions. But large ships do not sail in a straight line due to leeway, the effect of the wind pushing the ship's hull sideways. This was something the helmsman steering the ship at the ship's wheel had to correct for. The officer of the watch, usually a lieutenant, was responsible for the ship when on duty, and ordered which sails to set and take in. He would summon the captain if the situation required it. In strong winds, Victory might sail under topsails alone, perhaps with a jib and flying jib. In lighter winds, she would crowd on sail, adding courses, topgarnsails and royals. She might even run out the stunsail booms to set studding sails, pronounced stunsails. This was known as sailing large. But if the wind picked up, stunsails and royals had to be brought in quickly, as spars and sails could be damaged or torn away by a sudden strong gust. No sailing ship can sail directly into the wind. Victory's closest point of sail was 6 points off the wind. This was known as sailing close hauled or on a bowline. There were two methods of sailing against the wind. The first was tacking. This zigzag approach required precise sail handling and could strain spars and rigging. The alternative was wearing ship, an easier maneuver to perform, but slower, as it meant going the long way around. Anchoring a large warship like Victory was also a complex operation. The sea's depth was discovered by casting the lead, literally throwing a lead weight tied to a rope into the sea. The rope clearly marked every fathom, or 6 feet. The preferred depth for anchoring was 40 fathoms or less, though it was possible in deeper water. First, the ship reduced speed by taking in sail. When the ship came to a halt, the anchor was let go, with a marker buoy attached. As current and backed sails began to drive the ship sternwards, the anchor cable was run out, using 3 times the length needed to reach the sea bottom. It was the weight of this giant cable, as much as the anchor, that kept the ship in position. Depending on weather, tide and sea bottom, it might be necessary to set several of Victory's anchors to keep the ship safely moored. A less well-known inshore maneuver was kedging. This was a way to drag the ship against wind or tide, using manpower alone. The lighter kedge anchor was carried in a ship's boat, rowed out ahead of the ship, and let go. The crew then turned the capstan to haul the ship towards the anchor. This exhausting process was repeated as many times as necessary to move the ship into position. Another version of this was warping, in which ropes were attached to a fixed object, like a strong tree on shore, and the ship hauled towards it.
That's interesting.
To be healthier, knowledge is everything. Steps, calories, exercise minutes. Because proven quality sleep is vital to our health and wellness, only the Sleep
In naval combat, the first consideration was always the direction and strength of the wind. A ship upwind or to windward had the advantage and was said to have the weather gauge. She could choose if and when to initiate battle, while the ship to leeward had to struggle into the wind to reach her adversary. Ships of all nations sometimes flew a false flag, that of another nation, to hide their identity. This was considered fair practice, but to fire on an enemy without first hoisting your true colours was an unpardonable crime. When about to engage the enemy, the captain would order, "Beat to quarters." To the rattle of the Marines' drums, the ship was cleared for action. All temporary cabins on gun decks were dismantled and taken to the hold, so gun crews could work without obstruction. The sick bay was cleared away and all its patients carried down to the orlop deck. The galley stove was put out to reduce the risk of fire, and ammunition was moved up from the magazines to the gun decks. The ship's boats were launched and towed behind the ship. Here they were less likely to be smashed to splinters by enemy fire, and were immediately ready for any emergency.
You know, I never thought about that. I never thought about what would they do with the ships. I guess I always thought they left them on board, but that would be stupid because they could get damaged. And then if the ship goes down, what are you going to do? Never thought about that. Huh.
Sand was poured on the deck for traction, while splinter netting was put up above the decks to protect men from any falling spars or pulleys shot down by enemy fire.
Never thought about that
Every
either.
man then took up his
Never thought about that either.
station for battle. Captain and officers in full uniform on the quarterdeck. Top men aloft, ready to trim sail. Sharpshooters on the fighting tops. Carpenter's crew on the orlop deck, ready to plug holes below the waterline. Gunners' mates in the magazine, filling extra cartridges. The surgeon in the cockpit, ready to receive casualties. For 3/4 of the crew, battle stations meant the gun decks, manning one of the ship's 104 guns. It was a huge amount of firepower for the age, and made her one of the most heavily armed warships in the world. Her heaviest cannon were the 32-pounders of the lower gun deck. At point-blank range, these guns could punch through 2 feet of solid oak. Heavy breaching ropes held each gun in place. Otherwise, recoil would have sent 4 tons of gun and carriage flying across the deck after every shot. Each gun had a crew of between 10 and 14, which was divided in half if the ship needed to fire on both sides. Each crew was led by a gun captain. He was responsible for aiming the gun, his crew shifting its massive weight with handspikes, crowbars and wedges. When he was on target, the gun captain either applied a slow match to the touch hole, or as seen here, pulled a lanyard attached to a gun lock to fire the gun. To reload, one man first blocked the vent with his thumb or a stopper to prevent sparks getting into the barrel during loading. The barrel was then sponged to extinguish embers and wormed to remove debris. A gunpowder cartridge was inserted at the muzzle and rammed home with a ramrod, followed by the shot, and then a wad to keep everything in place. The gun was run out into firing position and a pricker inserted into the vent to prick the cartridge and spill the gunpowder. The gun captain then added powder from his powder horn to the vent and priming pan. The gun was now primed, ready to fire again. This process took an experienced British gun crew around 90 seconds, and they were generally faster and more accurate than their adversaries. As a battle wore on, the firing rate would fall dramatically due to exhaustion and casualties. Conditions on a gun deck during battle must have been horrendous. Noise, smoke, sweat, and gruesome wounds caused by shot, flying wooden splinters, and accidents. Battles usually began with a broadside, a ship firing all guns on one side in quick succession. For greater impact, the first broadside could be double-shotted, every gun loaded with 2 rounds. To guarantee penetration of an enemy ship's hull, the range should be less than 500 yards. Many captains preferred extreme close range to fight yardarm to yardarm. The deadliest maneuver was to rake the enemy, to fire a broadside into their stem or stern. Round shot would smash its way the length of the ship, dealing death and mayhem as it went.
That's kind of like taking someone's flank. I know it's past 15 minutes, but I didn't want to stop it during the fighting, so I will when this is done.
French ships tended to fire high, on the uproll, aiming for masts and rigging to immobilize the enemy. British ships aimed low, for the hull, trying to knock out guns and crew. At long range, a mile or more, round shot could be skipped across the sea, like skimming pebbles across a pond.
Huh.
Round shot, a solid iron ball, was the most commonly used type of ammunition. Specialist ammunition, such as bar shot, also known as double-headed shot or chain shot, was used to target masts and rigging. At close range, grape shot and canister, both packed with multiple smaller projectiles, turned a gun or carronade into a giant shotgun and were used to wreak havoc on an enemy deck. A captain might decide to finish the fight by boarding an enemy warship. Designated boarders armed themselves with muskets, pistols, cutlasses, and half-pikes. The enemy ship was bound tight by grappling hooks, and after a shower of grenados and stink pots, an early form of tear gas, the boarders would swarm across to the enemy deck. In such actions, morale, aggression, and momentum counted more than tactics. Though brutal, such battles were usually over quickly.
I'm gonna go ahead and stop it.
Before you renew Amazon Prime, watch this. Look, I love Amazon Prime. Free 2-day shipping is great. And like everyone else, I enjoy not knowing how...
I'm gonna go ahead and stop it here, and the next video will just be the finishing up. But I didn't want to stop it in the middle of the fighting kind of thing. I'm guessing it's over now, but it's going to be. So that was interesting. There's a lot of stuff I didn't know. I didn't know about the netting that they put up to protect any of the falling like masts and stuff. It's a dub kind of thing. But well, why would I know any of that? I have no idea. So I'm gonna end this here, and we'll come back with part 2. Like and subscribe, or a snake's gonna bite you in the genitals. I don't know. Have a good day. Have a good night.